And I'll be delighted to have a conversation afterwards to discuss any issues that might be of interest to you, whether related to the Israel Trail or the lessons that I learned on the trail, or perhaps more issues of current affairs and current events. For instance, an election that just might happen in 2 days somewhere over there across the Atlantic. But let's get started with the story of the Israel Trail. Imagine this. I'm walking along a narrow trail with a 50-pound pack on my back. And I find myself with a cliff on one side and a fall of at least 30 feet on the other side to the rocks below. And I'm walking along, and all of a sudden the trail stops. And I start to panic. I don't know what to do. Because if I turn this way, I'm going to fall off balance and fall into the rocks below. And I can't turn this way because my pack is hitting against the cliffside. I take 3 deep breaths. Thank you to Thomas Crum, who wrote a book called 3 Deep Breaths. And I slowly lowered my pack to the ground. I turned around, I retraced my steps, and I found where I had missed the trail sign. I was supposed to climb up the side of the cliff. Who would have imagined that? Rather than continuing on this narrow goat path. Well, I went back to pick up my bag, and I put the bag on, and something strange occurred to me. It felt somehow lighter, which makes no sense because nobody had taken anything out of my bag. Clearly, what happened was that nothing had changed in the bag, but something had changed in me. And when I realized that what had changed was my attitude, what had changed was my lack of confidence, a rebuilding of my confidence because I had found the trail sign. I knew where I needed to go. I had a sense of purpose. In February of 2014, I set out to hike the Israel Trail, the Israel National Trail, known in Hebrew as Shvil Israel. As Tzachi mentioned, it's a 600 or actually 670 miles long trail from the south of Israel on the Gulf of Eilat and the Red Sea, up, winding through the hills of Jerusalem, on the coast in the Galil, up to the border with Lebanon in the north. I did this 650-mile trail all alone. It took me 2 months with a 50-pound pack on my back. It was something of a challenge for a 50-plus casual hiker, as you can imagine. It's the kind of thing which is really done by the 21-year-old crowd, not the 51-year-old crowd. It was, for me, a transformative experience. Hiking for 8 weeks, 12 miles a day, alone with my thoughts, I experienced not just a transformation internally, but I developed a unique perspective on the history and people and the vistas and the geography of our Holy Land, of our ancestral homeland. Now, I have to share with you that I was also looking to heal. I had just completed a devastating divorce. A divorce that I hadn't looked for, a divorce that I didn't want. It was not my choice. It was, as you can imagine, something that turned my life and my world upside down. I was angry, I was frustrated, I was sad, I was full of resentment, but mostly I was in pain. I was overwhelmed by various different challenges. On the trail, in my life, and even sometimes national challenges where it wasn't just the heat or the inclines of any given day. I had crises of confidence, periods of loneliness. I would occasionally connect with my family and hear news that was upsetting, or even terror attacks in the country. Now, the truth is that experience I had on the side of a cliff may be something of a metaphor. I think it is a metaphor. Sometimes we have to put down our baggage. Sometimes we have to unload the emotional or psychological baggage that we're carrying in order to see and feel free enough to move forward on a new path, or to find our path, as it were. Elie Wiesel, Viktor Frankl, and many others have written poignantly about taking the personal and the national tragedy and horror of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, and translating their experiences into timeless wisdom, which helps to understand what one can do when facing personal challenges. And in Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl talks specifically about having a goal and taking one step at a time. My goal in any given day was to get to the night camp that day, where my water was waiting for me, where I could set up my tent. And my goal in general was to hike the Israel Trail and to achieve that as a general objective. And beyond that, my goal was to find a way out of the abyss that I had found myself in and to literally get on with my life. I meditated on mountaintops. I cried in dry creek beds. I wrote anguished journal entries and composed songs to lift my spirits. I looked back and inward, up to the night sky and down at the ants on the trail, over the valley to the next mountain range, and back behind me to see how far I'd come. What I discovered on the Shvil was a sense of self, a sense of personal and national history, and a perspective of sorts on the human condition. In my search for inner peace while walking the land of Israel, I realized that many of these truths could be perhaps helpful to others. The lessons that I learned on the trail gave me an understanding, not only for me to meet my personal challenges, but a way to understand and to develop kind of an approach for all of us to meet our challenges. Now, when I was going through my divorce, I read dozens of personal growth and self-help books. And many of them were very helpful to me. Some of them less so, but I always tried to find something to take of each of them. And I'm not suggesting that what I'm going to share with you tonight or what I wrote in my book is some new revolutionary theory that's going to change the world of a therapeutic approach to dealing with our personal challenges. But Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, a famous rabbinical sage of the medieval ages, wrote a book called The Path of the Just, in which he introduced the book by saying, I have nothing new to offer in the way of new insights, but sometimes repeating and reviewing the truths that we know can be incredibly helpful to both reassert them, to reinvigorate our understanding of them, and to reaffirm what we know to be either true or helpful. There were 5 lessons that I learned that I want to share with you today. And that's one part of the subject of my book. The other part of the book is actually walking the land of Israel. And the images that I'll share with you today and videos, I hope will give you a little bit of a feel for what it was like, not only to learn these lessons, but to actually walk day in and day out, walking through, trudging through the land of milk and honey. So let's get started. The first week of the trail, I left Eilat on a Sunday morning, February 16th, and made my way up through the southern Negev to a lovely little oasis called the Ashram B'Midbar. Through the Eilat Mountains in the Negev desert, I learned the first lesson that was going to inform the entire rest of my journey and that would inform the mechanisms that I developed to get over my divorce. Out in the desert, you'd be surprised. The kind of thing that we don't really realize when we live in an urban environment like here in Los Angeles. If you stop for just a minute and feel even a taste of the silence of the desert, then you might get a feel for one of the first lessons that I experienced. We so very rarely allow ourselves a real experience of silence. There's so much noise around us. Some of it's wonderful, talking, conversation. Some of it's less wonderful, the news, the traffic. When you're walking in the desert and you're surrounded by silence, hour after hour after hour and day after day, for me at least, I developed an incredible sense of humility. I had left my family, my 3 kids who were grown and didn't need me. I had left my job. I took a leave of absence. I hired somebody to run my operation at Media Central, so they didn't need me. My friends had their independent lives. They didn't need me. Nobody needed me. And it could have been that that experience in the desert was in some way overwhelming and upsetting, and maybe to a certain extent even making me feel small and meaningless. But it wasn't that. It was actually the opposite. I found the silence of the desert liberating. It gave me a perspective of sorts on, yes, my problems are real, but really in the vastness of the universe, they didn't necessarily really matter that much. This feeling was the kind of thing which, wow, that's loud. There were times when I took a video and just decided I wanted to be able to share this with my kids, really was the original intention. Because if you haven't been there, even a photograph doesn't give you the feeling of what it's like to be on your own, on a mountaintop, in the wind, with nothing and no one else there. Without belittling my own pain or problems, there's no question that this perspective made them more manageable. It reduced the intensity of the pain that I was feeling, because I basically discovered this sense that we're all part of something that's bigger than ourselves. And that for me was a very, very important first lesson. It's a lesson actually, by the way, that we take from our Jewish tradition. Most of us know that Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moses was chosen as the leader of the children of Israel when the people of Israel were taken out of Egypt, as we're going to celebrate in 2 weeks from now at Seder night, because of his humility. I'm not suggesting that I'm Moses. I'm not suggesting that there's even a, but the lesson that we've learned, the understanding that having a certain modesty about our place in the world is a very important and traditional element of being the kind of person that we want to be. And for the record, we have stories about that here in America, about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, or others that we would like to see ourselves emulate, who were, if nothing else, very humble. The second lesson that I learned climbing up a mountainside. Not a cliff, but a very tall mountain, where I tried to ascend rocks that were literally the size as tall as I was. And at one point I sat down on the side of the mountain and I said, I just can't do this. I didn't sign up for a challenge course. I wanted to get out for a hike and clear my head and try and get over my divorce and get on with my life. I didn't sign up for some climbing up of Mount Doom like Frodo the Hobbit or something. And I didn't have any Sam to carry me or to carry my bag. So I thought of taking out my phone and calling out the search and rescue squad of the IDF to come pick me up off the side of this mountain with a helicopter. But in the end, instead of doing that, I basically said to myself, Aryeh, you're on the side of a mountain. You may have made a bad decision in terms of getting here, but there's nobody who's going to come and save you from this. This is your reality. You need to face that reality. Make a good decision and try and find your way out of it. I did. And that night, when I got to my tent and started to write in my journal, I realized this was the second lesson that I was learning on this trek. I was on the side of a mountain and I had to accept that that was my reality. In my tent that night, with the wind buffeting the sides of the tent, I wrote in my journal, how Aryeh, you're divorced. This is your reality. You need to get over that. You need to accept that reality and move on. Now, I'm not suggesting that we always have to accept the reality that we face. Sometimes there are things that we can change, but there's that pithy aphorism that says, please grant me the strength to accept the things that I cannot change, and the ability to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Well, it gets it very, very right. There are some things in that first part of it that we cannot change. And for me, being divorced was one of them. I never expected to find myself divorced. And because of that, it was all the more painful for me to be in a situation that I hadn't anticipated. This issue of focusing on what we need to do by accepting the situation that we find ourselves in is the second lesson that I learned on the trail. Acceptance. This is a good example of accepting a situation that you find yourself in. I'm at the side of a cliff here. I'm supposed to walk down there, along here, along this little path here, and then going down to the bottom of the hill. I think you can hear me describe this. See those two guys down there? I'm going to zoom in this. Two men walking down there towards the end. There's two guys down there. And I asked them when they were about over here on the cliffside. They were sliding down that part on their bottom, and they have no cheek, no turmoil. I said, is this going to be possible, the 24-kilo pack? I called down to these two young men as they were right down here, and I said, is this going to be possible with a 50-pound pack on my back? Actually, first I said, is this possible? They were sliding down there on their rear ends. They said, yeah, you can do it. It's not the... So I said, and what about with a 25 kilo with a 50-pound pack on your back? They called out to me, don't do it. Sakanat mavet. Danger of death. Well, talk about acceptance. At that point at the top of this cliff, I turned around. One of the advantages of being 51 and not 21 when you're hiking the trail is that you actually have some, or at least it seems, maturity, that you can make good decisions after bad decisions. And I said, there's no way I'm going to risk my life going down there and falling down this cliff. I hiked for 3 hours, back and all the way around the mountain to get down to the bottom here where the night camp was. That issue, for me, was just reinforced, or just ended up reinforcing this issue of acceptance, of acknowledging the reality. And you know what? It was cathartic. It was enabling, because by accepting the reality, whether at the top of that cliff or in my tent thinking about being divorced, it enabled me to be opened up to the next possible stages in my journey. One of the hardest days on the trail is here in what's called the Carbolet, where I found this nice family of Ya'alim prancing away, as I say. It's the steepest ascent, and the most difficult part of it is that you're walking along the ridge, the edge of a crater, with the wind about to blow you off as you walk and try to balance, because you're not on an even setting, because you're walking here along the edge of the cliff. and trying to balance yourself with, did I mention I had a 50-pound pack on my back?
Yes.
At this point, I think you can understand where my acceptance comes from. Michael J. Fox is the name that I think you may be familiar with, who faces his own challenges, said once that acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It means understanding that something is what it is and there's got to be a way through it. That sums up the second lesson that I learned on the trail in a way I think better even than I could. Wandering through the desert in the Negev, very close to the Sinai Desert, reminded me again and again and again of one thing. Can you imagine what it was?
The Exodus.
And because we're 2 weeks before Pesach, I'm glad that you said that. The Exodus. The wanderings of the children of Israel, of the people of Israel through the desert, having been liberated, the redemption that we experienced in Egypt, and making our way for 40 years through various deserts to the land of Israel, was something that was constantly on my mind. And I want you to know that the hiking that you do in Israel is incomparable, is phenomenally different than hiking that you do anywhere else in the world. And there are beautiful hikes in the world. I grew up here in California, and Yosemite is one of the wonders of the universe in terms of nature. And there are, of course, treks, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail out here in California, the Pilgrim's Trail in Spain and Portugal, treks down in South America, in Machu Picchu and Nepal and what have you. And they're all beautiful and unique, and they have their own, obviously, beauty and attraction. But there is nothing that compares with walking as a Jew in the footsteps of our forefathers. And this connection that I had, this visceral connection between the people of Israel, the land of Israel, my place within the wide swath of history, the shared history that we have, the shared destiny that we have as a people, and of course the miracle of the founding of the modern nation state of the Jewish people, Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, was constantly accompanying me in my journeys. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I wandered through certain parts of the desert was how frustrated Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, who I keep referring to, was with the lack of gratitude on the part of the children of Israel. It's a theme that repeats itself quite a few times in the Torah. The children of Israel complained, where are the wonderful cucumbers that we used to get in Egypt? When every morning they woke up to breakfast in bed with the manna awaiting them outside their tents. They had the well of Miriam accompanying them, giving them fresh water all through the desert, and the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud that led them in the way and protected them. And yet they complained, where is the meat that we used to have when we were back in Egypt? And that lack of gratitude was something that occurred to me a number of times walking through the desert, and most particularly when I burst into tears the first time I saw a flower, having spent 3 weeks in the desert. Because the lack of color is sometimes overwhelming when you're walking day after day after day in the browns and yellows and the beauty and yet the stark beauty of the desert. I was extremely grateful for all sorts of elements of my life. Not just the flowers, but the first bed I slept in after a week of being off in the field. It was a mattress that was this thin. As far as I was concerned, it was like sleeping on a king-size bed with one of those memory foam mattresses, like the best you could possibly imagine. The first time that I took a shower after 4 days of hiking through the desert, you could imagine there were certain things in the hike itself that I was tremendously grateful for. But of course, my gratitude extended beyond the specifics of the hike. I do want to say that all of the lessons that I'm sharing with you were, of course, generated by physical aspects of the trek itself. And the gratitude was definitely one of them. But as I said earlier, it was reinforcing something in me. It was not necessarily something new. I'd always been the kind of person that is very appreciative of all the blessings in my life. But walking through the land of Israel engendered in me a much deeper sense of appreciation not just for the miracle of my being able to participate in this experience of our renewed sovereignty in our ancestral homeland, but the wonderful support and friendship that I had from my friends and family in the course of the divorce, as well as in the course of hiking the trail. And let's be honest, I was very grateful for the 28 years that I had married to my wife, building a Bayit Ne'eman b'Yisrael, quite literally, a faith-filled home in Israel, and all that had as part of it. Somebody just said this looks like a lunar scale. A lunar scape. It's very, very true. This is one of the least known nature reserves in Israel. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the Judean Desert Nature Reserve. Nobody has. Tzachi, I'm not counting you. You're just unusual. And there's a reason nobody's ever heard of it. If I ask you about nature reserves in Israel, you'll say, sure, I've been to Ein Gedi, there's Masada, there's Tzipori up in the north, there's Caesarea, there's all sorts of nature reserves in the country. But nobody's ever heard of the Judean Desert Nature Reserve. And why is that? Because there's nothing there. And you said it's like a lunar landscape. Well, that day I walked for 8 hours without seeing a single soul. And I was surrounded by gray rock and black dirt. And it was so desolate that there were no birds. There were no beetles or ants on the ground. And I had one of the most powerful and transformative experiences on the trek in the midst of that desert. I realized that this is the desert that King David fled to when running away of King Saul. This is the desert that some of our prophets went to. And it occurred to me in the middle of the day walking there, if we come back to this experience of silence, that there's something about being in a desert like this with no distractions whatsoever. No birds, no beetles, no wind, no plants, no shrubs, that somehow opens up our heart to the kind of wisdom that was given, I'm not saying I'm a prophet, but to our prophets, the prophets of Israel there in the desert over the course of generations years ago. I had an incredible meditative experience there that day in the Judean desert, which I'd be happy to share with you, or you can read in my book, if you're so inclined, maybe in the questions and answers period. It could have been frightening, that kind of silence and desolation. But as I said before, it wasn't. It was liberating, if anything. As you can see, then we moved from the desert into the more hilly region of the Jerusalem mountains, where I went through something of a transition that was geographical, but it was also emotional as I moved then to get nearer to my home. I basically was circumnavigating my home of Beit Shemesh here. In the 4th week of the trail, I not only found myself in territory that was much more familiar, it was in fact also incredibly moving to be in the Jerusalem hills, the Hebron hills, which are basically the hills and the land of our ancestors, of our forefathers. And so for me, one of the things that welled up in me as somebody who moved to Israel 35 years ago, so 30 years ago, 30 years before this experience, I keep repeating how privileged I feel and how grateful to be part of this experience in renewed sovereignty in our land with the establishment of the modern state of Israel. That gratitude for me was only reinforced by wandering through these Jerusalem hills. I, in fact, also had some lighter experiences that relate to that gratitude. Here you see me in front of the Roman road. Have any of you ever been to this part above Emek Ha'elah on the way up to Jerusalem from Beit Shemesh? This is literally a 15 or 20 minute bike ride from my home. I was that close to home. But here I'm walking up steps that were created by the Romans 2,000 years ago to enable them to bring munitions and supplies up to Jerusalem as they attacked our ancient capital in order to destroy it. And they built these steps in order to help their mules get up the steep hills. So of course I took this picture with a funny face saying, "Ha! You see that? Where are the Romans now?" And that sense of history accompanied me as I circumnavigated Jerusalem or went around my hometown of Beit Shemesh. There were lighter moments on the trail also, like when my kids kidnapped me, blindfolded me, and took me to have dinner with my closest friends who I was very grateful to have, who had supported me through the period of the divorce and the trek. But also it was a surreal experience, because for them they were just going out to dinner in Ein Kerem just like any other night. And here I am in the same shirt that I've been hiking in for 4 weeks. Yes, I did wash it occasionally. Sitting around a table and having dinner in a way that I hadn't done in all 4 of those weeks. And I was profoundly uncomfortable. I was surrounded by friends and loved ones and my family and my kids, and I was all alone. So I was very happy to get out back on the trail the next day, even though it was cold and rainy. And in the end, it was so cold and rainy that I called up my daughter, who was living at home, and I said, "You know what? Come pick me up. Take me home. I'll do a laundry. I'll have a shower. I'll sleep in a nice bed, my bed. And then tomorrow morning you'll bring me back to the trail. I'm 20 minutes away." She said, and I quote, "Ani lo marsha." I don't allow it. And I'm like, "Moria, you're living in my house. You're driving my car. What are you talking about?" But she explained and was correct that by coming home it would break the tempo and the rhythm of the trip, and it would take me out of this experience that I was so deeply enmeshed in. And of course she was right, although she did pay for it later. I spent Shabbat out in the fields with a friend, a good definition of friendship, my friend Tzvi, who hates camping, hates sleeping outdoors, and came and spent Shabbat with me so that I wouldn't be on my own. And of course it was a Shabbat full of acceptance and humility and a lot of gratitude. And then we celebrated Purim, where my friend Aaron came to read me the Megillah at night. And we sat around a campfire, he and I and a few friends. And that was the end of the first half of my trek. I then jumped up north the next day by car and bus and eventually taxi cab to get to the north for 2 reasons. One is that the Red Guide, the book that one follows, kind of the unofficial guide to hiking the Israel Trail, suggested this in terms of the time frame that I was hiking, that you want to get up north to where the flowers bloom before the blooming itself is over. And for me also, I wanted to jump up north because I wanted to be able to walk home. Rather than ending the trip at the very north, I wanted to be able to actually walk from the trail back to my hometown. I want to say a word as we begin to accompany me from Kibbutz Dan in the north down to Tzfat, where I spent the next Shabbat, with a little bit of background. I talked a lot about gratitude, and I even said how grateful I was for the life that I had built with my former wife. But you can imagine that gratitude was a little bit hard to come by, given the resentment and anger that I felt about her leaving. And I need you to understand that our marriage was something that was extremely, extremely special. It was unique. It was a spiritual bonding that went back almost 30 years. And it was the paradigm of a love affair and a partnership and a friendship between 2 soulmates. And so my wife's leaving was, there's nothing to say bad about divorce. Some couples naturally need to split. Some of you, some of our families and friends, of course, have gone through that. So I'm not saying anything negative about divorce as an institution or as a phenomenon. In my particular situation, it came out of the blue, and it seemed to be incredibly irrational and unjustified. And that's one of the reasons why it was so painful, was because it made no sense. And so because of that, it was very hard for me to actually drum up the gratitude that I'm talking about within the context of that pain. I have to share with you that, just as background, the final exchange I had with my former wife was when I was giving her the get, the bill of divorce at the rabbinate in Jerusalem, where before I handed it to her, which is the act of actually formal divorce, I said to her one last time, because we'd had these conversations for 2.5 years leading up to this, you don't have to do this. We don't have to go through with this. Even now, even though we've negotiated and signed an agreement and all the rest of it. And she said no, she really wanted to go through with it. She wanted her independence. And I looked at her and I said, you know, I still love you. And this may be the greatest act of love I could possibly carry out, because I want you to be happy. And if this is going to make you happy, then I'm willing to do it. And at that point, I knew that our marriage was over, but of course I still had great love for her and incredible appreciation for the life that we'd built together. The reason I'm sharing that with you is because it's one thing to talk about a difficult divorce, and it's another thing to understand the depth of the pain that was caused here to me and to the rest of our family. And it leads directly into the next lesson that I learned on the trail. Because as I was walking around the north of Israel, I found a number of elements that instilled in me kind of a need to express some forgiveness of others. There was the author of the Red Guide, this informal guide to the trail, who kept misleading me and sending me on the wrong paths and sending me up steep inclines without telling me how hard it was. And I had to find it in my heart to forgive him. And I was ruminating as I was walking along the border with Lebanon, how wouldn't it be nice, and isn't it actually important, for the Arabs to forgive the Jews for our insistence on returning to our ancestral homeland, and our insistence on existing, and our insistence to defend ourselves. And isn't it imperative to bring real peace between our peoples, for the Jews to forgive the Arabs for their incessant hostility, for 100 years of their violent opposition to our very existence? Isn't it important for the Jews to forgive the Arabs for attacking us and their terror attacks? And also, as Golda Meir said, to forgive them for forcing us to defend ourselves and thereby ending up killing or injuring many of them. This idea of forgiveness was something that accompanied me in the course of these next few days of hiking there on the border with Lebanon. And I was thinking a lot about forgiving, obviously, my wife for the decision that she took, forgiving myself for mistakes that I'd made in our relationship or in other aspects of my life, forgiving God for allowing this to happen. And it must have been those ideas of forgiveness that were percolating in my head that led to one of the most pivotal events on the trail for me. As I found myself on the side of a pond or a pool on the Chatzbani River, Nachal Snir, on the border with Lebanon. This little pool here, which is part of a stream that flows, but this is a slightly quieter area of it, is somewhere where my wife and I had taken our 3 children year after year after year, multiple times on family trips. And we had frolicked in these waters happily, obviously, as a family. And when I stumbled upon this, because I didn't realize that this was on the trail, I was at a momentary loss, because I realized we would never be back here again as a family. And that, of course, made me very sad. But at the same time, I decided to act on that sadness with this understanding of both acceptance and gratitude and humility. And I stripped off all my clothes. I looked forward and back on the trail to make sure nobody else was coming. And I jumped in the water. And it takes a lot longer to tell this story than it actually transpired, but something happened when I jumped into the water. You may be familiar with the concept of mikveh in Jewish tradition, the mayim chayim, the living waters of the mikveh, as if they come from the waters of Eden, which women immerse once a month in traditional Judaism, and men immerse sometimes once a month for Rosh Chodesh, for the new month, which we just celebrated yesterday, or certainly on Erev Yom Kippur, on the eve of Yom Kippur, which I do every year, usually in the ocean, in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. But when I jumped into this water, I experienced something of a mikveh experience, entering like the waters of the womb, the waters of Eden. And something happened as I went in. You're talking about the passage of maybe 5 or 10 seconds, and then coming out of the water, dripping, of course, with water, I found myself flooded with tears. You notice that I cry a lot. It's okay, I'm Californian, I grew up here. I was covered with tears, but tears not even so much of sadness. It was tears of joy, because what I realized as I came out of the water is that I had reached a new and deeper level of forgiveness of my former wife. If before I had the intellectual acceptance and forgiveness that she, as a woman, as an adult woman, had the right to make a decision if that's what she wanted to do, that was on the intellectual level. But at this point, coming out of the water, I felt it here, or I felt it here in my heart, and I really knew that I had reached a new level of forgiveness that enabled me to then literally get up, get out of the water, and stride ahead with a renewed sense of both self and appreciation and acceptance. I then moved ahead through the Galil, walking through the most beautiful forests and springs that so many people are just unfamiliar with because they're off the beaten track. And I had a few other experiences of forgiveness that helped to make this such an important element of the lessons that I learned on the trek. I like to quote sometimes Leo Buscaglia. I won't go into detail, but some of you may know him here from, he taught at UCLA for many years. He taught a very popular class called Love. And in it, one of the things that he talks about is the importance of forgiveness. Forgiving our parents, for instance, for being human. And forgiving others that either, whether it's actual injury or imagined injury. And of course, we know from our perspective as Jews that forgiveness is very much a part of our tradition. If it's on Yom Kippur or otherwise, we see it as a basic and fundamental principle, not only of the importance to ask for forgiveness, but to actually offer forgiveness. And that's a pivotal part of our receiving God's forgiveness for anything that we have done on Yom Kippur. That's predicated on our forgiving others for injuries they've caused or for even perceived injuries. So I'm happy to share with you some of these visuals and videos of the trek itself, but I want to take a little break because we've gotten very intense about forgiveness and the divorce and what have you. And on the trek itself, I occasionally took a break too. You see, that's the beauty of being 51 years old, is that I had the ability to occasionally say, you know what, I'm going to treat myself to a really nice breakfast at a winery and taste some wines while I'm at it. And so that gives a little bit of a break on the trail, as you can see, and on the intensity of telling the tale, as it were. Well, you know, I mentioned something about how special it is to walk the land of Israel as opposed to the Appalachian Trail or other beautiful sites in the world. And I want to tell you a very short story that occurred to me in the Baram forest, which I don't have a picture of. But as I was walking over this hill, down into a valley, along a dirt road, and note, it was a dirt road, not a paved road, I came across a small tomb. Blue in color, surrounded by a little fence, and I was kind of tired and I was ready for a break, so I took my pack off and got out my water, and I walked over to see what the little plaque said on the tomb, and it said, Kever shel Yeshayahu ben Amoz, which I'll translate into English, meant nothing to me, the grave of Isaiah the son of Amoz. So somebody was buried there. As I was sitting and drinking my water and having a granola bar, I decided, because there in the Galil I had the opportunity to recharge my phone, and I occasionally turned it on to do this kind of thing. So I looked up in Google what that meant. Who was that, Yeshayahu ben Amoz? You can imagine my shock to discover that this was Isaiah the prophet's gravesite. Yeah, that Isaiah. Swords and plowshares. Only the most important, prophetic, visionary Jewish leader, or one of the most important in our entire tradition. Now, here in this region, we'll get to it in a minute, there's another mountain called Har Meron, Mount Meron, which is where a rabbi named Shimon Bar Yochai is buried. And there, 300,000 people a year go on a pilgrimage on Lag BaOmer to visit Shimon Bar Yochai's grave. And here I was stumbling across the grave of the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah the prophet, which didn't even have a paved road to access it as a pilgrimage site. I'm sharing that with you for two reasons. By the way, the historicity of whether that is or isn't the actual grave of Isaiah is apparently debated. I found that out later when I was looking it up in writing my book. There is a grave site in Jerusalem, which is also supposed to be the grave site of Isaiah. I'm sure that scholars and archaeologists can have that debate for years. For me, as you can imagine, the historicity was not important when I stumbled along that grave. No more so than stumbling along the grave in Tzfat of Hannah, in the Hanukkah story of Hannah and her 7 sons, coming across these indications of our people's life and residence and civilization there in the Upper Galil was, for me, an incredibly powerful moment of reconnection to our shared history and shared destiny as a people. And on a lighter note, coming across hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of wine presses in the hills of the Galil, where you can see here where they would press the wine and the juice would run off to be collected here. And not in an organized archaeological site that's been documented and serves as a visiting location, but just on the side of a hill as you're walking by, there's remains of some first temple or second temple building and a wine press from 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. And of course, we know it to be a Jewish settlement. Settlement in the general term, not in the pejorative use of describing Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria, of course. That was another kind of connection to our people and our history. And the truth is, here I'm on Mount Meron that I was describing, and you can see Tzfat, the holy city of Safed, in the background. These connections to our history and to our people were a very, very important part of the trek for me, as you can imagine, as I then made my way from Tzfat down to Caesarea on the coast, going across the Galil and making my way down the coast. And we're now in the 7th week of the trek. And I'm wondering, do you remember at the very, very beginning I mentioned something about a cliff? So here's that cliff, where I mentioned that I walked along the path and kept walking and then found myself at it just around this corner, stopped. So here's what I missed. Here's the trail sign. Here's some handholds that supposedly, I was obviously enjoying the walk too much, that I just walked by it and continued on this goat path along the side. But I made my way, meeting all sorts of friends along the trail. Talk about humility and acceptance. When I came around a bush and saw this fellow standing there on my trail, I literally said out loud, "What are you doing on my trail?" And he looked at me, and I said to him, "Move," and I was going to force him to move, and eventually wisdom got the better of me, and I recognized with a bit of humility and a lot of acceptance that this guy's a lot bigger than me, and I ought to go ahead and schlep through the weeds to find him, which I did. I walked through some of the first settlements of the Jewish pioneers in the Galil near the Kinneret, in Yavneel and Degania. And these were, of course, walking in the footsteps also of our forefathers, but they're really our more modern forefathers of the New Zionist era. And the people that I met, like these Arab Muslim kids from the south of Israel, were a very important part of the trail. Whether it was Bedouin or Christian Arabs or Druze or Muslim Arabs, or of course many, many Jews that I met on the trail or that hosted me at their homes as trail angels, these interactions were also an important part of the trail for me, reminding me of the multicultural nature of our society. Multi-ethnic Israel, with so much acceptance and tolerance as part of it. It reminded me again of the importance, if we really want peace between Arabs and Israelis, of this combination of acceptance and forgiveness, as well as a little bit of humility and a lot of gratitude for what we've been able to achieve, both peoples, over the last 100 years. I then made my way across the Carmel and to the sea. And there's something about the sea, I suppose, growing up in California and going to the sea, the Pacific, literally every, maybe 2-3 times a week in the summer, and living in Israel on the Mediterranean Sea and going there at least once a week, that has always made me feel like I'm home. And there's something about the sea that gives us a feeling of endless possibilities. Here I'm at Jisr al-Zakra, which is a Arab Muslim Bedouin town just north of Caesarea on the Alligator Stream. And I realized that at the top of this hill, I was going to come for the first time to the sea on this trek. And it was just glorious. And there was something about looking out over the water, which I've since learned that psychologists have identified the waves from the sea and their ongoing continual presence and the never-ending horizon that you look out and can see in the distance but can't see the end of it, are so important for the human psyche when it comes to understanding and appreciating the endless possibilities that exist in front of us. For me, that was a very important transition as I headed into the last week of my trek and headed home. And there's a reason for that. Talking about coming from the area of Caesarea down and then down around the coastal plain, around the north of Tel Aviv, and off to Beit Shemesh. And the reason for that is because I recognized as I got to the sea that I was almost home. I realized I was going to do this. I was going to achieve the goal that I'd set out for myself. I was going to finish hiking the Israel Trail. But that left a very, very big question in front of me. What next? I'm going to end up home, and I'm still going to be alone. I'm still divorced. Now what? I set this goal and I achieved it, but what is going to be next? And so the truth is that having forgiven, full of gratitude, with a great sense of acceptance of the situation that I was in, and from a place of deep humility, I used the time that I spent on the sea thinking about those possibilities. And knowing that my possibilities for the future had to be anchored in some sense of purpose or goals, which is what we started our discussion about in talking about Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. What he discovered was that people in the concentration camps who had a purpose to live were more likely actually to survive. And he developed an entire theory of psychotherapy called logotherapy, which focuses specifically on having a purpose, having a goal. Look, Stephen Covey writes very similar things in his 7 Principles of Highly Effective People. Pop psychology also recognizes the importance of setting goals, having an objective to achieve. But for me, it's Viktor Frankl's concept of having meaning in our life that really motivated me to begin the process as I spent the last Shabbat on the Sharon beach outside of Herzliya and started to make my way home, started me on a process of setting personal goals for myself. I think that you understand that the main goal of the trek was to try and find a way to get on with my life. And obviously walking in nature, in the land of my people, where our prophets and our forefathers lived, and where they fought and died, created in me a wonderful focus for my existence and my public activity with regard to the reasserting the legitimacy of Israel and reawakening a sense of Zionism among everyone that I interacted with. But there was a lot more of that I wanted to pursue. And so as I made my way home, I started to think about what my personal goals were going to be. And I took a lot of wisdom from one of the aspects of Viktor Frankl's work, because he talks about 3 aspects of bringing meaning to our lives. One of which is activity, acts, one of which is relationships, and the third of which is self-awareness. I call them doing and loving and just being. And I was certainly doing. I was walking the land of Israel. And I was certainly interested in relationships and loving, whether it was my children or my former wife or what have you. And I was definitely exploring issues of personal growth and being. But the question that I was asking myself is, what is going to come next? And so I started to set myself goals, professional goals and personal goals, in terms of doing more to promote Israel in the media, but in the political realm and on college campuses and church circles and otherwise. I started to think about joining my friend Yosef in his renewable energy company, which I had been helping informally for a while, but I wanted to do more with that. I decided that I was going to open a winery, finally taking my hobby for 20 years of making wine and turning it into an actual profession. And I had thoughts about my personal goals, about increasing my appreciation for my faith, and trying to find ways to translate the experiences that I had on the shvil, on the trail, into my regular everyday life. And also about how I was a very involved father, a loving father for all the years of my children's growing up, but wanting to be even more so now as they were adults. And I also had a unique experience walking along the Yarkon River in the northern neighborhood of Tel Aviv, where I came upon this stump of wood. This is the trail sign that was on it to tell you that you're on the right path. And I saw this beautiful set of flowers, which I thought was so sweet that some municipal worker had taken the care to plant and to tend on the top of a tree stump with the shvil sign on it. But then something, I would say, almost miraculous happened. There were 2 turtle doves that were flitting about in the trees behind and above. And they came and they flew around, and just after I took this picture, they landed right here. Now, I know that we all know that there's this urban myth. It turns out to be true. I looked it up when I was writing my book, that doves mate for life. And the first thing that I thought of when I saw these 2 birds land here was, what, they can mate for life and we couldn't? That could have been very disturbing and a melancholy type of reflection, but it wasn't, because it triggered something immediately in me. Where looking at this, I sensed that if not a message from God, it was certainly a message I was prepared to accept. That I thought that and became confident that I was going to be open to love again. That I was at that point ready to move beyond the anger and resentment, having forgiven my former wife. But more than that, after 2.5 years of this process, that I could envision the possibility of loving again. And at that point, I continued on the last few days of the journey. I almost, by the way, texted my kids to say that. This is not my kids, by the way. These are 2 of my son's friends who came with him, with me to have a barbecue on the last few days of the trip. I almost texted my kids at that point to say to them, I'm ready to love again. But yeah, you're laughing, because I think if you have kids, you understand that would have been too early for them to have that kind of a casual communication from their father who'd just been divorced. I then found myself on the last day before getting home at a, again, kind of a sign where the trail sign says go left. That's what the sign shows. But I, whose name is Green, remember, followed the arrow, the green arrow, to the right, because I was going to spend the night in a beautiful little Bedouin tent encampment in Mitzpeh Harel, about 10 kilometers, about 6 miles or so away from my hometown of Beit Shemesh, where I spent my last night. And I was visited by a friend, and he was visited by a friend who wanted some of our beer. And I spent that last moment, that last morning, reflecting on all these lessons that I had learned. That at base, taken to heart, an individual with a humble sense of purpose has greater motivation to forgive, more to appreciate, and more reason to be grateful, and an enhanced incentive to accept both historical reality and present reality, because we just want to get on with our lives. And this combination, for me, was an enabler for me to look forward to achieving the goals that I had set for myself. It was true for me on the Shvil. It's been true for me in my life, and I think it can be true for others who are seeking some sort of solace or direction. And that's basically why I wrote the book, to describe my experiences on the trail, also describe how they helped me face my personal challenges and how they might be able to help others who are facing similar hardships. Because I'm convinced that these 5 elements can be the foundation of the healing that we are all looking for within our personal lives. The truth is, I'm convinced that this may be a model or some sort of a basis for real reconciliation between Arabs and Jews in the Middle East. But that's a different book. That's going to be my next book. Obviously, I also wrote the book because I'm looking to bring to a wider audience some of these themes of the legitimacy of the founding of the nation-state of Israel in the historic homeland of the people of Israel. And some of the themes that are spiritual and Zionist and national that permeate both this discussion tonight, but also are themes in my book. Our connection to our ancestral homeland and our return there is something that has become something of an ongoing obsession almost by me in all of my public activity. And that's basically the end of my story, or the end at least of this part of my story. I walked home, as I said I would, in Beit Shemesh, met by my son, and this is my new daughter-in-law. They had just been married a half a year previously. And some friends had met me on the street as I came in. Actually, a few did, but that was just one picture of them. And my daughter and my son had arranged a kind of unique homecoming for me after 8 weeks and 1,000 kilometers, still with that 50-pound pack on my back as I came into the house.
Dad, you have to run through. Wait. Right through it. He did it. Amazing. Video.
I had to trip and fall when I came in the house.
Take a photo in a second.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I try not to show that to the younger audiences.
You're awesome.
After the Shvil, when I was finished, I basically moved to a new position in my work, became an emeritus so that I could still be involved but not responsible for the day-to-day operations. I did find new love and was married 3.5 years ago to Miriam, beautiful and caring and wonderful, intelligent, very strong and yet sensitive woman. And we have 9 children between us, or sometimes I say 12 children between us because my 3 are married. And I've moved ahead with the idea of opening a winery. I've been working for 3 years with my friend Yosef and building renewable energy projects throughout Africa. I have also written a book and achieved that as a separate goal. And I just want to close by saying that with these experiences that I had in the Schwiel, physically, and the processes of the inner and outer exploration, and the personal growth that I experienced during and after the trek, I discovered something of a path which I am relatively confident can be of help to others that are facing similar challenges or decisions, because it's based on the time-honored wisdom of some giants, from Talmudic sages to philosophers and modern psychologists and teachers that I've mentioned already. And I go into much more detail in the book. And sometimes I think it is important to go back to our very beginning, and that kind of metaphor that sometimes we have to set aside our baggage and reevaluate in order to be able to know what our next steps are. If you can just imagine cresting that Carmel mountain range with the sea laid out in front of us, with the sun setting over the Mediterranean as you come over the rise, the exhilarating sense of arrival and of possibilities, confident with a sense of purpose and gratitude and acceptance and humility. Those 5 things, the humility, the acceptance, the gratitude, forgiveness, and a sense of purpose, have found a place in me. And you don't have to hike for 650 miles on the Israel Trail in order, with a 50-pound pack on your back, in order to experience that. I would hope that our conversation tonight might have inspired you in some way, whether it's in terms of these 5 issues, or whether it's even inspiring you, even at this point in our lives, to take a hike, take a trek, come visit Israel again, and come to explore. Should you choose to do so, I look forward to welcoming you with a glass of wine on my balcony in Beit Shemesh when you next come to Israel. Thank you very much for your time.